PGCE Research Bites, student-teacher research from the team behind Emma and Tom Talk Teaching.
Hello and welcome back to PGCE Research Bites, where we showcase some of the high-quality student-teacher research going on here at the Cardiff Partnership for Initial Teacher Education. Hopefully, whether you're here in Wales, studying in Cardiff or much further afield, you'll find something that's of interest to you in this video, where I'm joined by my colleague Emma and Jack Siddall, who has just qualified as a secondary art and design teacher. So congratulations about that, Jack. You've done really well. And in the process, carried out an assignment, an inquiry into his subject in order to make a change in his practice. And it's that we're talking about in this episode today. So, Jack, you were given a completely blank slate, really. You could pick any topic you like to inquire on once you landed in your second placement school, with a view to making some sort of change or evolution in your practice. So what was it you actually zeroed in on once you got yourself into school?
So obviously with assignment 2, it can be quite a broad thing because it's an inquiry process. But what I chose to focus on was diversifying and decolonising the curriculum within secondary art. And that is basically building the idea that it's like the importance and responsibility of being an anti-racist curriculum designer. So that's the title. But I guess what that actually really meant to me was looking at curriculum building in a way that we can try and make it, what's the way I would describe it? I guess it's like looking at trying to design a curriculum in a way that is fitting with the Welsh Government's anti-racist policy. And obviously with the new Welsh curriculum, we are now curriculum designers as well. And there's a lot of responsibilities in there that probably previously wouldn't have fell on teachers to deliver on this level. So yeah.
And I guess there were a number of important steps that you took before we come to sort of, the literature that guided this. It probably makes more sense. It's probably more authentic for you to tell us, what were you noticing, without mentioning the name of the school, what were you noticing in school that sort of made it clear to you that actually that you needed to make some kind of intervention or change to your practice to help this?
This was a natural decision to lead in this direction. So when I first arrived at the school, it's a school in Cardiff. It is a school in Cardiff. It's a city school, and it's one that it's got very high rates of poverty. We've got like over half the school is eligible for free school meals. There is a lot of challenges there. It's a super diverse school as well, but it is a school that is very much like got a whole range of staff who want to try and make the best out of what they've got in every sense of that meaning, but one thing that really stood out to me when I first looked through the curriculum in my first week there, I was looking at their sort of curriculum pathway. I was looking and flicking through all the books just to try and see what kind of work they'd done previously, because I just felt like that's something that really makes sense when you turn up somewhere new. You want to know what they expect, also what they've done before, so you can maybe bring something original or support something that already exists there. But it just became really, really stand out to me straight away that there wasn't a single artist that was from as a POC. There's not a single female artist. Like every single artist that was currently within the Key Stage 3 curriculum was a white man, and more often than not a dead white man. And it's like very like cliche, but it's true. It was like that. It just seemed a little bit outdated for where we're at now.
I'm laughing, Jack, and I'm sorry to interrupt you, but there was even a quote from a pupil in your assignment about who we're going to study next. I think that you quoted the pupil and they said, as long as they're not dead.
Yeah, genuinely. And it's like, and I think because my mentor was super on board with this, they were constantly taking little moments and notes of things that happened like that, even things that I didn't necessarily see around the room, because obviously when you're teaching, you're doing a million and one things. You've got like 33 students in a year 9 class. You're not going to pick up on everything. But yeah, it is. I think the kids are far more aware of this than we realise, and they are looking for something that resembles what it's like to live now. It is important to focus on these pillar stones, these like huge important artists as well. And they do provide a really big context to how we view art in this big sort of scale. But it doesn't really fit into a lot of students' lives. It doesn't make a lot of sense how art fits into their sort of worldview, I guess.
Yeah. And you did something just to finish off this bit about, what did you do to confirm what you what you needed to do. You looked at the art portfolios at Key Stage 4, I think, Key Stage 5, and because you
Yes.
you didn't want to make any assumptions.
No, I
did
didn't
you?
want to make any assumptions. So obviously at Key Stage 4 and 5, there was a lot more like it's going to be a lot more student-led. And then that's when I started to notice that there was more diversity within the range of artists there. And I think that is something that probably tends to happen quite a lot in the creative subjects. Once it's led by students, they start to select things that actually maybe resemble their own interests and are outside of, I guess, what we sometimes think is important. Sometimes you can look at students' work from Key Stage 4 and 5 and you're like, why are they going in this direction? And it can sort of, as an educator, can make you panic a bit. But as long as there's some relevance to it, then you can support that and maybe even guide them in different directions as well. But I definitely think this led me to think that Key Stage 3 plays a really big role in actually the new Welsh curriculum as well. Like if we think about citizen building, there's actually the biggest scope for that in Key Stage 3. And by the time we get to Key Stage 4 and 5, unfortunately, we do start to feel the pressure of what it's like to deliver high quality results in GCSE and A-level. So it almost means that is the best space to explore, really. And with discussions with my mentor, who was super supportive and was like, we need this update, and thinking about different things we could do, they were super on board for me to design some curriculum with this in mind and something that reflected the demographic of the school and thinking about how it can engage the community of the school as well. Yeah.
I think that's a point that's worth picking up on, actually, before we sort of dive into the detail of the inquiry that you did, is that it's quite potentially a tricky situation to find yourself in. You're being asked to do an inquiry, potentially to make a change to your practice that is going to kind of affect what goes on in your department. You're quite a transient visitor to that school and that department. You're there for about 4 months. You're also trying to pass the programme in that department. And so you're not in a kind of really clean-cut and easy situation when you're doing that. And for me, I mean, I was marking this work when it came in. It really jumped out at me that you could, particularly on this topic, have gone in as like a massive social justice warrior and put everybody's backs up. And that could have actually ended incredibly badly. And so it was just really interesting to me that you did navigate that difficult thing well. And obviously, hats off to your department, because they could have not been very pleased, but they were on board as well.
Yeah, I think the really key thing is that as obviously the term social justice warrior, it carries quite a lot of baggage these days, It almost implies that, it's very much tied into the idea of like cancel culture. It's tied into these other bigger sort of topics, which actually I think sort of create this sense of like anxiety about not wanting to do something wrong. And that doesn't necessarily mean there's like space for reflection. And I've always kind of come from this place where I felt like we need to be able to actually just prepare to like look at ourselves, think about what is or isn't working, and not necessarily punish ourselves. A lot of the structures of racism or colonization, they're huge. They're gonna be quite passive, and you could, anyone from any background, like, could genuinely be supporting quite outdated narratives, and you can just erase things by not mentioning things and not making them part of the curriculum as well. So it wasn't a process of shaming. I wasn't out here like, I'm gonna get try and rally something up on Twitter around you. I think that's it. I think it's very unfortunate that social justice warrior timeline coincided with a point in time on the internet where everyone just sort of jumped on someone on Twitter and tried to turn it into a very big, hyped up, high engagement thing. Whereas really, in many ways, the best place to have these conversations are in more like face to face and keeping the human involved in it. And we can try and think about like, how has this come about? Maybe it's just because all the teachers are really struggling for time, and that they're just sort of adapting things that were made a long time ago, and could just do a bit of an update as well. So yeah, I think it was just really productive conversations, I think, and most people can tell, they know what they're teaching, and they know it needs areas that could be updated in as well. Yeah.
Another challenge of this assignment is that, this is a master's level assignment. So you had to do some reading and engage with sort of theoretical, intellectual, she says in air quotation marks, knowledge. But you are also tasked with, and I think this is something that made your work incredibly powerful and authentic, is you also need to have an understanding of the knowledge of your learners, the knowledge of the context, the knowledge of the school, the particular sort of subject-specific knowledges that, and you sort of have to synthesize all of that in order to decide what you're going to do in practice. So perhaps you could just give us a bit of a flavour, like what was the literature telling you? What did you come to know about the kids? And how did that in turn then guide you in what you were going to do?
I would say almost before I even got to that point would be that I think because I came from like a humanities background anyway, I previously studied international relations, and then I've worked in the arts my whole life, and that was like a sort of little hiatus, I guess, and then come back to it again. I've always had this kind of mindset where I'm able to sort of like apply lenses to things and think about viewing things through a lens, and I think very much the opportunity this year to be educated in the new Welsh curriculum and think about almost having a lens for it, I could actually approach it with that in mind, you know, and that isn't necessarily easy because there's a lot of big barriers to actually implementing that. But the first thing was more just thinking about, I always think about this, what is like an authentic learning context for anything? I think when we look at the new Welsh curriculum, I try and think about it more as like starting from the big ideas down to the small ideas, you know. It's not about thinking, oh, I want to use this artist, and now I have to find a way to make it make sense with one of the four purposes. It should almost be like, know your learners, observe, start to think about how that fits into a bigger citizen building mentality, because it is ultimately, education is quite a political project. It is, you know, we're like, we are in many ways like civil servants. In some countries, teachers even are. But we are trying to implement policy. So I guess what I did initially was just trying to get to know the school and get to know what was going on there. I think what was really clear to me straight away was from having conversations was, one, we knew that the students in the area weren't really exploring the city. They didn't access the city in the same way that a lot of people would around Cardiff. They didn't know much about Cardiff. In my year 9 class, for example, we had a quite high proportion of students, because of their faith, they're from one particular sect of Islam, they did not draw any living things, they didn't draw any faces, and so that instantly created a lot of barriers around maybe them accessing things like portraiture. And those were two quite clear points for me of like thinking about more like lesson building. But to then to bring it back more into the research, it was just more about what is actually going on with art and design education right now, you know, trying to understand what are the key issues there. We know more and more that within the arts and within our specialty that we're being asked to do more with less continuously. And all of the literature that I found was really, you know, it was really clear that there is a sort of looming arts crisis there, and it's starting to become somewhat of an afterthought in some capacity, and that doesn't necessarily mirror the real working world. We know that arts in the UK is actually some of its strongest position it's been in a long time. So yeah, it was interesting to me to think about that, but also just sort of to consider what the pupils were like in that school as well. But the main thing was thinking about on the backdrop of this new era of how to put it, this sort of new era where we find ourselves in with a new curriculum and also building towards this anti-racist Wales. It's like, how can we do that in our own curriculums? How can we do that as an individual teacher to support that as well?
Something that struck me in your lit review actually as well about the nature of art and design at the moment is this whole shift towards the sort of, how did you put it, like bedroom artists? Like
I think that's a good point, actually. That was something that I was thinking about with like authentic contexts here in particular. It's like, what does an artist look like in 2025? You know, if we think about art as existing solely within gallery spaces, then that's quite an antiquated view. In reality, an artist now is many things, you know, whether that's a visual artist or a musician or whatever. You're your own publicist. You're going to be networking yourself. You're going to be your own, you know, brand as well. It's changed, and I think rather than trying to encourage my students to be, the next David Hockney, which I would love for them to be, that's an unbelievably unrealistic expectation to have on a student. I think what's more advisable would to be look at like something that actually seems somewhat achievable. A lot of people now, most working artists that I've come across or know personally or don't know at all, are genuinely working out of their own bedrooms. This is something, done via social media. They have their own websites where they'll sell their prints or they'll sell their artwork or they'll engage in like brand collaborations as well. And it's just as authentic to have someone come in who's got, 10,000 followers and talk about how they practice as an artist, than just, going and seeing one of the greats. It's still, if anything, it probably makes it seem more achievable and more realistic and something that can be done for these students, as well.
I feel like we're sitting on the brink of a really interesting discussion at some point in Wales about subject specialism, because for whatever reason, we've seen some issues around subject specialism, whether it is that there have been some misconceptions around the curriculum framework or some schools don't have the luxury of having any subject specialists in certain subjects because of the recruitment crisis, whatever it may be. I think the thing that really jumped out at me was the way, obviously you can go and you can get to know your pupils and you can do some reading and you can speak to your department. But then as a subject specialist, and I know obviously you said you studied international relations, but you've been in the arts, you are an art specialist. You were then able to select the artists that you felt those pupils needed. And you came up with some really, really interesting choices that was such a good fit for the pupils. Tell us about the artists that you actually came up with.
So yeah, I think that's it is an interesting conversation thinking about whether this is the massive benefit of having a specialist, isn't it? This is what is always going to be the advantage. And also, you can still be a specialist, but not necessarily be as minded about certain artists. I guess another debate is about whether everyone is a curriculum designer or not, and how that looks. But for the artists that I chose, the first artist I chose to work with my Year 7 cohort, which was virtually all of the school of Year 7. I think I nearly taught every single class, was an artist called Stephen Wiltshire, who's quite famous for having savant syndrome. And so he's an autistic artist. He calls himself an autistic artist. He's also a Black British artist, but he doesn't actually specify as that. It's like he feels like for him what's more important is his journey of autism and how art has also been a voice for him. He was nonverbal for a lot of his life, and then art was a means for him to communicate as well. So for him, he uses this insane talent that he has, which is he goes up in like helicopters and then draws these, afterwards, from memory, draws these hyper detailed pen sketches of these landscapes. And I think what for me was screaming at me thinking about that artist was this idea that getting the students from this area to then treat Cardiff as this place that they could go and explore. So within that lesson, very much sort of built around other bits of research I looked at. I think there's one by like Diamo, and it's like this like art as a, what is the actual, let's see. I think it's like, I'll try and have a quick look. Sorry. Basically, so there's one piece of literature by Diamo, and it essentially tries to bring metacognition into the art classroom as much as possible. And essentially I wanted to try and get as much collaboration around them trying to get to know their city that they live in. And we did this idea of like memory maps, and they all came together and drew on these big pieces of paper and tried to almost cross-pollinate and share knowledge and build a picture of Cardiff that they could all piece together. And I think it was actually really surprising for someone who grew up in Cardiff as well, how little knowledge outside of their like estate and area that they had. They just aren't going to the city. They're not using it in a way that is beneficial to them. There is so many aspects of why this is the case. It's not like there's no blame put on them here. It's just completely it's poverty at the end of the day. Poverty is always going to restrict the opportunities for any individuals in any capacity, and a lot of these kids just don't get the opportunities to actually leave where they live. And so I thought it'd be a good sort of avenue for them to have some artwork that sort of supports getting to know their city, but also with this sort of decolonial, diversified lens, it opened up loads of other avenues as well. We talked about neurodiversity within that lesson, and even it almost felt like you couldn't make it up, but I had some students over from the base in that lesson, and as soon as they found out that they were learning about an autistic artist, they genuinely high-fived themselves and like gave themselves a high five. And it seems so simple, but just little bits of extra consideration do lead to so much more inclusivity. And I'm for sure, like, when that happened for those students, they suddenly felt like they were part of the classroom. You know, they weren't on the peripheries. And yeah, and then this also just sort of led to more engagement around Cardiff. And I'm sure for even some of them, just a sense of like belonging. I know we use Cynefin quite loosely and we throw it around a lot, but I think that is how you connect people to your city, at least through art in that way. With my year 9s, I mentioned this earlier about a lot of this, quite a few of the students weren't able to participate in a lot of the artwork. They were actually, couldn't draw living things. So this is why I led towards pattern as my sort of avenue. And obviously within the Islamic world, pattern and art have a big relationship with one another. I think the wrong assumption in that point in time for me would have been like, I need to do a whole topic on Islamic art. I think that would have had the potential to just alienate it and almost really spell it out very loudly what I'm doing. And I think throughout the whole process of this, I was trying to do things sort of more passively, but just authentically and not being overt about what I was doing. I didn't want it to seem insincere, and because that's when it does seem really insincere and it starts feeling like you're ticking boxes and it starts feeling like you are just doing it because of this pupil or whatever. It was more just trying to be as inclusive as possible. So we focused on 2 artists. One was Yayoi Kusama, which is one of the most from Japan, who's like one of the most sort of well-known artists in the world right now. And then another was Yinka Olori, who's a British-Nigerian artist, and they both use pattern in lots of different ways, but Yinka Olori particularly focuses on this idea of like play and heritage, and I really tried to bring that into the classroom. And then we had this like collaborative like patchwork piece where they all came together at the end and they all debated about how it could come together. And even then, they're like the amount of debates they were really, really mature, and I didn't expect that from my really large year 9 class. But they even ended up resulting in like designing this pattern and putting one of the students' work in the middle, who was of Nigerian heritage, and because they felt like it made sense to also have a British Nigerian artist's work reflected in a British Nigerian student in the middle of this piece as well. And I honestly felt like, when I was writing this in the report, it's like, no one's going to believe that these changes are doing this. This seems like I'm actually faking it. But it was even for my mentor, they were just like, this is, they were really, really like excited by this. And they were really, really, I collaborated on a lot of this stuff with them. And it was really nice for them to observe it and be like, this is really making change. And I think that even for them, it was quite invigorating and, nice to see that these kind of things can be done. Of course, time is always going to be the issue. And luckily, in this moment in my educational journey, I do have some. So yeah, that's it, really.
This is the sort of inquiry project that it would sort of feel out of place and wrong to try and kind of quantify to mathematically what the outcomes were. So what sort of more qualitative, because you've given a hint at, some of the qualitative things that occurred, the comments that the pupils made, the decisions that they made that were sort of facilitated by the changes to the curriculum that you made. Were there any sort of other sort of conclusions that you were able to draw from this about I hate the word, but the impact of what you did?
I think the success criteria was still really clear. Skills were completely embedded in this curriculum design. I think at the beginning, I always, with any project or anything, the lesson building, I tend to try and, not apply too much pressure to the students straight away, particularly in our subjects. Confidence is everything. I want them to feel comfortable to make mistakes, because mistakes is play, and play can lead to a lot, but play needs to be intentioned and it needs to be within a understanding of something already. And so there does need to be some context there, but I don't think you need to, give them a 15-minute lecture on who this artist is straight away. That's not the way I'd approach it. It'd be more about modeling some kind of exercise that allowed them to play. For example, with the pattern lesson, just got big sheets of paper out, masking tape, lots of groups. We're like, okay, make as many patterns as possible, you know? And then we had a debate in the class about who had the most patterns, and we got the groups to come up, and we'd be pointing things to like, do we think that's a pattern? And so we'd be like, no, why is that not a pattern? And that then led to us thinking about how you create patterns. And then the outcomes really are the means to actually measure the success of the lessons. You know, they created pieces that actually, you know, they were obviously differentiated by outcome, but also they learned valuable skills in every single thing that they did. With year 7, I think within art, I think you can't get around the fact that sketching and drawing is just the backbone of everything. The more you do, the better you're going to have a grasp of a lot of stuff. But you don't want to exclusively do that. So there was a lot of modeling around that, and everything in that Stephen Wiltshire lesson I created was based around drawing, really. And you can do that in a very prescribed way, or you can do it more built into this idea of getting to know your city. And even for me, I was thinking about, it doesn't make sense to do painting with year 7 straight away, or I mean, you can do it, but particularly in the school I was in, I was like, I'd rather teach them how to draw with a pen, because they're likely to have that at home. Whereas if I start getting them to use clay and all these materials, and they can't take that skill outside of the classroom, then it's almost a bit redundant. And with a lot of our subjects, you hone those skills outside of the classroom. You're not going to become the best artist in the world within an hour once a week. It's what you do outside of that. And so I felt like pen skills and drawing skills were essential with year 7. And the same with more like year 9, it was more like collage based and lots of, you know, thinking about pattern, but more design focused as well. And more examples about using an artist who is working today and collaborating with like fashion brands and things like that as well. Yeah.
And just to sort of round it off, what's great there about the outcomes that you've expressed is that you don't have to sacrifice on the kind of subject-specific skills development, subject-specific, concepts, when you're also trying to address something quite big, such as diversifying and decolonising the curriculum. You know, you can marry the two together. So, going forward, what have you learnt about what it takes, what sort of steps it takes to start diversifying, decolonising the curriculum in art and design?
I think the biggest thing is that as an educator, if you're not critically examining your own practice, you're going to be likely to sort of reinforce racist and classist power dynamics. And I think particularly in the literature in this assignment, I really focused on showing what decolonisation is. It's this idea of trying to remove all these power structures that do exist and think about how you can dismantle them. And for me, this is something that I really think about very carefully. You know, it's every bit of information you receive as a student really, really defines how you view something. I think about this one art lesson I had in school, and it was all based around African masks. And that was my first time that I was exposed to African culture. And for a long period in my time, what did that teach me about African culture? It almost set it in a period of time like it was primitive, like it was tribal. And rather than considering that it's full of many nations, you know, it's full that are really different to one another with different levels of like development. And, you know, it really, so as much as it's great to think, oh, I want to do these African masks, they look amazing, without any sort of context in there, the construction of Africa within my mind as a student growing up was one of primitive, you know? And so I think it's like, these are all the questions you have to ask yourself. And it's just, the main thing is that we're constantly assessing what it is we're including, and that a diversity of voices and perspectives is always going to lead to much better outcomes. And that if we constantly put forward what we think is important, we might be at danger of minimizing voices and ultimately engagement, you know, and that's it.
Wow. Well, Jack, there's an enormous amount for everybody to dig into there, whether they're an art and design specialist or not, whether they're a secondary specialist or not. There's so much to look into, and that is a truly outstanding example of how you do classroom inquiry that really makes a difference. So a huge thanks to Jack for joining us on PGCE Research Bites today. Thanks to Emma for joining me in our studio as well. We'll be back with another one soon. Bye for now.